if you want to win this week, you're in the right place. Let's take some time to discuss the best plays for week 14. And we start with Derrick Henry at $7,900, who's topped 15 points just once in the last month and didn't even hit 6 points last week. But if you look at his schedule, he's been an underdog the last 2 weeks. His team is playing from behind, so yeah, the running back's probably not going to have much success. But this week, he faces the dead last ranked, 32nd ranked tackling unit of the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's a great matchup for Henry, who has a rushing prop around 90 yards. He's also a favorite this week and averages around 32% more touches when he is a favorite, so expect around 100 yards here for Henry. And then there's $6,100 Ezekiel Elliott, who this week is in the matchup of all matchups. You can see here he's facing Houston. The Cowboys have the highest team total at 31 points. They're 17-point favorites. And the Texans' run defense ranks 29th in the NFL this season. They allow the most rushing yards by over 100 more than any other defense in the league. And Zeke, over his last 3 games since getting healthy, well, he's scored 15 plus points in all of them, even a game where he played 30% of the snaps because of a blowout, but the snaps have been slowly coming back up to a full workload. So expect close to 20 touches in this one for a player who continues to produce. I think he's a great play. And I also think at the wide receiver position, Juju Smith-Schuster, whose price point continues to drop and his ownership continues to drop, a great spot to be targeting is a nice play. You see, last week Juju only had 4 targets, but this team only threw 27 total times. And look at this, his snaps rose to 74% after playing limited fashion because of injury last week at 35% of the snaps, and he was out there for about 66% of the passing plays compared to 40%. So the role was increasing a lot. The issue is pretty simply that his team wasn't throwing the ball as much, and when they get back to throwing around 40 times like they have on the year, well, it's going to be good news for Juju. And another wide receiver who saw some good news after dealing with injury was Jamar Chase, who returned last week, and he played 94% of the snaps. He earned 8 targets. It's like he didn't miss a beat. And in his return, he had about 17 fantasy points. He now is averaging over 10 targets per game his last 4 games. The clear #1 stacking option for Joe Burrow, an attractive stack this week. And more specifically against his Browns defense that ranks number 28 in the NFL, every matchup for him individually against these cornerbacks will be good. Denzel Ward has not been good at all this season, and then he'll have a great speed advantage against Emerson, who runs about a 4.6, completely different levels compared to Jamar Chase. And now let's talk about another wide receiver working his way back from injury, and he's an attractive play. And that's Jerry Jeudy, who at this point is just $5,400 on the opposite side of Kansas City. A big reason why he's an attractive play, well, Courtland Sutton's not expected to play, and we need a run back for these Kansas City stacks. And according to Scott Barrett on Twitter, he says that the Chiefs have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers. That helps Jeudy, where Russell Wilson loves throwing to the slot. Now, Jeudy in his last game only played 37% of the snaps, but he was dealing with injury. He's getting healthier this week. Expect around 80 to 90% of the snaps in a nice price point here. So now let's talk about a tight end, and we go to TJ Hawkinson, who might be the best play on the slate against a poor Detroit secondary at just $5,100. As you can see from my tweet here, Hawkinson averages with the Vikings now 8 targets per game. I mean, that's top 3 numbers at the tight end position, and nearly 12 fantasy points per game. That's top 5 numbers. He faces the Lions, who allow the 3rd most points to the tight end position. Play Hawkinson and this next guy. And that's going to be his quarterback, Kirk Cousins, who's in this great game environment. He's a 3-point underdog with a 25.5 point team total. When a quarterback has a nice team total and is an underdog, it's a great spot for fantasy. And here's some proof. In 5 similar situations in his career, he averages 22.4 fantasy points. Keep in mind, that's not including the DraftKings bonus, just fantasy points, and 285 passing yards. So around like 24 DraftKings points in these situations is great. And now he faces the number 29 ranked Lions secondary with great stacking options. Play some Cousins. But what about the quarterback on the opposite side of this game in Jared Goff? He's actually the favorite, a 28-point team total, and he's coming in right now as the highest owned player in the DFS blueprint, link down below on Patreon if you want to check it out. And that team total of 28 points, I mean, it is fantastic. It is not something that we can ignore at this price point. And last week, the matchup that he's facing in Minnesota, they gave up 370 passing yards to the Jets in Mike White. However, Goff is coming in at around 10% ownership right now, which is not as appealing as compared to Kirk Cousins, who's coming in at like 5% on the opposite side of this game in just as good of a situation. So I'm getting away from Goff, but I'm going towards his running back, and that's $5,800 DeAndre Swift, who appears to be back after leading this backfield in touches, opportunities, and snaps last week. This led to him scoring over 21 fantasy points, 18 touches, going over 100 yards, by far his best game since week 1. And now he gets a matchup against the Vikings, who give up the 6th most receptions to the running back position. Swift is the number 3 per touch player in the NFL, averaging over 6.5 yards per touch. So that's one solid $5,000 player. Another one is going to be Deonta Foreman, who, look, he's coming off the bye. He averages 14.2 points in 6 starts without Christian McCaffrey. Now, the key for Foreman is if the game stays close. In close games this year, he's averaging a whopping 25 touches. This would lead the NFL. Almost 20 fantasy points, would be top 3 amongst running backs, and over 125 yards per game. He's been elite when the game is close. And this week, he's just a 3-point underdog, which implies that the game will be close, so get to some Foreman who is going to be low owned. We slide back over to the wide receiver position, and we look at CeeDee Lamb at $7,500, who's just in an elite matchup. He'll see majority Desmond King in this game, who allows a 70% catch rate, and Lamb against all of these Houston cornerbacks, Steven Nelson, Thomas, he has at least 4 inches in size of. I mean, that's a massive advantage. And over his last 5 games, he's averaging 9 targets, and he's gone over 18 fantasy points in 4 of those 5 games. Your only concern here is if he doesn't get there early, they might run the ball in the second half. Now, a more frustrating wide receiver is $4,900 Adam Thielen, but if we're playing Kirk Cousins, we're probably getting to some Thielen. He's only top 10 points once since week 8, but the problem is he's facing top 10 secondaries. You get the Jets, you get the Patriots, you get Dallas, you get Buffalo. All of these are top 12 secondaries this season, but this week is by far an easier matchup. As mentioned earlier, those lines have a bottom 5 secondary. Thielen has his price point dropping, his ownership dropping, but his situation is as good as it's been all year. Now, another wide receiver is DJ Moore, who's coming off the bye at a fair price point of $5,500. All the talent in the world, but always in a bad situation. But that might be about to change, because with Sam Darnold in his career, he averages 14.5 fantasy points, nearly 10 targets per game, and over 70 yards per game. I mean, this is basically like a $6,500 wide receiver. You're getting $1,000 less because of the poor play of PJ Walker and Baker Mayfield earlier in the season. So Moore's a nice mid-range play, and then if you're looking to punt, Isaiah Hodgins is really interesting from the Giants because his snaps have increased every single week to a season-high 81% last week. And this led to good usage. 15 fantasy points, he finds the end zone, and he gets 6 targets. I mean, he's huge. He's a 6'4", 220-pound wide receiver, so the red zone upside and touchdown upside is there for a player now playing 80% of the snaps or more. So wide receiver, we've hit on some expensive guys with Jamar Chase, the mid-range and the cheap range. Now let's go back to tight end to find even more value. I'm pretty surprised to see the rookie Greg Dulcich at just $3,400. I mean, he becomes as easy of a play as it gets because he's a nice and cheap run back in your Kansas City stacks, coming off of arguably his best game of the year. Dulcich just finished last week as the tight end 2, only behind another rookie in Cade Otton, putting up 6 catches, 85 yards, and 8 targets, and now Cortland Sutton is expected to miss this week. In the DFS blueprint, he's definitely picking up ownership as a top 3 owned tight end this week because he's been good, he's cheap, and he's a nice run back, but I agree with this ownership. It's good chalk. Now, if you're looking for a pivot at tight end, it's $3,300 Daniel Bellinger, who returned last week from injury, having eye surgery for the Giants. And now Bellinger, in back-to-back healthy games, has played exactly 97% of the snaps, including last week, and he's led the Giants in his last 2 healthy games in targets. He's been the leading receiver. He's a very rare tight end that's not leaving the field. Yeah, he's a rookie, so he's a raw product, but he's out there and he's earning targets, and he's cheap at low ownership. Now, a player who is lower owned than I thought he would be is Joe Burrow, who looks dialed in. He's just $7,000 flat against a bottom 5 Cleveland defense, and over the last month, he's been the #1 graded quarterback on PFF. He leads every single quarterback in the league in accuracy this year, and now he's getting Joe Mixon back and healthy, and he's getting Jamar Chase back and healthy, yet he's just $7,000. He should be $7,500 plus. And now a quarterback who is $7,500 plus is Josh Allen, who's expensive. He has a nice team total of 26.5 points, and he's faced the Jets 1 time this season. And he looked good in that game, putting up nearly 27 fantasy points, but he did it on the ground. 86 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, and you might be saying, oh, but he can't sustain that. Yeah, but if he didn't get the 86 rushing yards, odds are he's throwing for close to 300 yards instead. Although he's expensive, he continues to have affordable stacking pieces in Dawson Knox, Gabe Davis. I mean, you could just single stack him with Stephon Diggs. He's a solid play. And another solid play is T. Higgins, who's $7,000 flat. In the DFS theory that we talk about in my DFS course is the flat price principle that basically just says, hey, he's going to be low owned because people will go down because they think they're getting a perceived discount. And some of those players they might go down to are Chris Godwin, who's right there, and he's been fantastic. Tyler Lockett, who continues to score touchdowns. They might go a little bit up and find CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think you're going to get a unique ownership number here on T. Higgins. Now, you most definitely won't get any ownership discounts on Amon-Ra St. Brown, who we've been saying should be an $8,000 receiver, and he's still not there. St. Brown has now averaged this season in healthy games. He's #4 in wide receiver efficiency, over 10 targets per game, and 22 fantasy points per game, legitimately a top 3 player. Just expect a very high ownership number here. He's currently coming in as a top 3 owned player in the DFS blueprint. And now I want to make you aware of this prop right here, over a half a passing yard for Justin Herbert. Obviously, he's going to throw for 1 yard on Sunday. This is a promotional prop by Prize Picks, and you can get it with a free bet up to $100 on prizepicks.com. Just use the code SAL22. When you use the code SAL22, that's SAL22. Again, you get that free bet, meaning if you put in 20, you get 20 right back. You put in up to $100, you'll get 100 right back, and you could use it on that prop that he can't lose. Herbert just throwing for 1 yard. Check it out, link down below. So we talked about CeeDee Lamb, and his teammate Michael Gallup's also interesting. After earning 7 targets, he now has 7 targets in 3 out of his last 4 games now that he's healthy, and he faces this Texans poor secondary. At this price point, I like Gallup. I'm not so much into the Dak stacks, but he's a nice value one-off for you. And so is his teammate Dalton Schultz. I mean, when you have a 31-point team total and you're facing a really poor defense, basically the entire team that we've talked about to this point with the running backs and the wide receivers and now the tight end are in play at just $4,400. Schultz now averages in 23 starts with Dak Prescott 12.7 fantasy points per game for some reference, that would be top 5 amongst tight ends this season. So yeah, he's looking good at this tag. Okay, now let's discuss James Cook at $4,600. Just a very cheap running back if you're looking for a cheap punt play this week, because last week, well, he started to emerge. He saw 20 touches. He saw 16.5 points. He split the snaps pretty 50-50 in terms of Devin Singletary's usage, and he looked fantastic, way better than Singletary. Now, this is sort of a risky play, but if you're looking to get really different, he's the cheap running back you should go to, because if anything, in this great offense, maybe the usage is only going to increase. He goes from 45% of the snaps to 65%, and this usage starts to become more stable. Now, maybe the most stable player in the entire NFL is Jalen Hurts for fantasy at $8,100, 6 straight games of 20+ points, and I love this Eagles coaching staff. They play the Packers in week 12, and they attack their weakness. What is that? The run defense, and they run for almost 400 yards. And then they play the Texans last week, and by far their weakness is their cornerbacks and their secondary. So what do? Well, Hurts throws for 380 yards. And that opens up the question, well, who do they play this week? Well, it's the Giants, who rank 31st in their secondary coverage and 27th against the run. So in general, their defense is bad, so you might see sort of a combination. And this combination is what we saw in week 5 against Arizona, when he's going for over 300 combined yards on the ground, and in the passing game, still a solid performance. So play Hurts, and then if you're looking just for a pure pivot in the mid-range at running back, this is only just for ownership basically, and because the guy's getting touches, it's Najee Harris at the same price principle that we talk about in the DFS course that I have as DeAndre Swift. When one player is the same price as another player, especially at the same position, one guy is going to garner a lot more ownership and be perceived as a major value, and that's DeAndre Swift this week for sure. But because of that, Najee Harris at $5,800 is probably going to come in somewhere around 4 or 5% owned. For a guy who just saw 18 touches last week, he's still heavily used. Yes, it's a poor offense. Yes, it's a worse game environment, but the reason you would go here is mainly for the ownership pivot. And now another interesting play is DJ Shark, because he won't be that highly owned, and if you run him back in your Minnesota stack, he's a quick score type player. He'll be low owned. He's a really sneaky way to get different in this game. Last week he put up 98 yards. He played a season high 84% of the snaps. He looked really good, and he's a clear starter now. If anything, the rookie Jameson Williams seeing more usage will cut away from Josh Reynolds. So there's another cheaper wide receiver. Now let's talk about a running back who's pretty interesting to me, and that's Joe Mixon, who's battling back from some injuries here, and he's just $6,900 expected to play in this one. The last time he played Cleveland, just 12.9 points, but his team was trailing. He still played over 70% of the snaps, earned 9 targets. So yeah, we know he's game flow independent. And in this second matchup against Cleveland, they're still bad against the run, ranking 30th overall. It's a really nice spot as a 6-point favorite for Mixon, who's below $7,000, and he's kind of going under the radar in some senses this week. Now, another player going under the radar, and obviously we have to hope he plays, is the tight end for the Cleveland Browns. He missed last week, but that's David Njoku at $3,900. There's a lot of bad media out there right now, deservingly so, for Deshaun Watson, but as the games go on, he's going to get the legs back under him for a once top 5 quarterback. And when this happens, David Njoku should benefit. If Njoku is back this week, it might happen as soon as this week. Now, your only concern is that right here, when he returned from injury in week 11, he only played 35% of the snaps and was limited. The week after that, he played 80%, but what happens now from his return from injury? We need that 80%. We can't get the 35%, otherwise we're left hanging here. So this is for sure a risk to be playing Njoku, assuming he plays in this one. If he doesn't play, I don't really have much interest in the backup Harrison Bryant. Now, if you want to see the projections, rankings, ownership, and more, all updated up until lock on Sunday, we can check out the DFS blueprint. It's linked down below. Best of luck in week 14, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.